time from your... So we should stop.
Are you in Bangalore now, Tejal?
No, I'm in Bombay. I came just before the lockdown. So
okay.
I'll be going back now by the end of this month.
So shall we begin?
Okay.
Sure.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second talk in the Science and Society series. The idea behind organizing this series came about last month when Mahavir Narwal passed away of COVID on 8th May. He was a scientist based in Rohtak in Haryana. He was committed to social justice and embodied the image of the scientist whose vision stretched beyond the lab into a concern for society, for politics, and for a hopeful future of humankind. So it is to him that this series is dedicated. The series brings together a group of eminent scholars who share a progressive vision of the relation of science to society. It is a vision which sees, as Ambedkar and Periyar did, a role for a scientific and rationalist temper in challenging socially oppressive hierarchies, a vision that sees the importance of an ethical role of science and the ethical engagement of the scientific community. And finally, it envisions science for the many and not just for the few. And with this vision, let me introduce, I have the absolute pleasure of introducing today's speaker, Dr. Tejal Kanitkar. She's a fierce critic of the assault on science and rational thought and a strong voice for the development of a public scientific temper. Tejal also has a long-standing association with the People's Science Movement. She holds a master's degree from the Department of Mechanical Engineering, University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and a PhD from IIT Bombay. Currently, Dr. Kanitkar teaches at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in the Energy and Environment program. Those of you who follow Tejal's work would also know of her famous talk on everyday obscurantism. Without further ado, may I hand over the mic to Tejal.
Thank you, Rakshi, for that generous introduction and for inviting me to speak. I think the series has many speakers who spent many years with the science movement. So I'm not quite sure what more I bring to the table, but so I'm going to do what I'm told I do best, and that is be provocative. So that is, I think, what I'm going to do. And am I audible? Is this? Yeah, I did see that Professor Ramanujam had shared had a presentation. I don't have a presentation, so I hope it's fine that I speak without one. I've tried to organize my thoughts, but then let's see how this goes. So let me begin by saying that whenever I write or speak about scientific temper, I always go back to this one statement from the statement of purpose of the Society for Scientific Temper that Professor Pushpa Bhargav and Abdur Rahman had founded in the 60s. I find it very useful and very enduring, that statement, which says that prioritizing reason and rationality means that you adopt a philosophy that knowledge can only be acquired through human endeavor and not through revelation. That the very basis of scientific thought is inquiry and a rejection of claims to knowledge that attain from authority. And whatever that authority, whichever authority that may be, it might be otherworldly, it may be spiritual or even ancestral authority. My grandmother said so, is also not science. So let me begin with an example. Last year when I was speaking about pseudoscience around the time of the National Scientific Temper Day, when Dr. Dabholkar was assassinated. I was speaking about pseudoscience, and this was when this Gaumutra party, drinking party was organized, as a cure for COVID or a prevention. I don't know what it was, prevention or cure, but it was organized. And there was, of course, a lot of some sitting MLA had participated in it, who later contracted COVID and then went to a regular hospital for treatment. But I was looking for some written material on this Gomutra thing, and I came across an article that was titled Gomutra, cow urine in brackets, a multi-dimensional drug. It was published in the International Journal of Research in Ayurveda and Pharmacy. Journal, it's an Indian journal, and they had published this paper. And the authors had reviewed what they call in vitro studies and had listed the potential benefits of Gomutra for, I'm quoting here, for prevention of, for antibiotic resistance, as a fungicide, as an antiseptic, as an anthelmintic, as a bioenhancer in cancer drugs, as an immunostimulant, and a host of other things. And so I thought that the paper was an excellent example of what science is not. So you have the glorification of cow urine in Ayurveda, an ancient text, which is collapsed with laboratory studies of the usefulness of cow urine. Now, I mean, I would have questions about government money being used for studying some of these things. ICMR is currently set up a lab to study the benefits of cow urine. I mean, and it's framed in that manner. You're studying the benefits of cow urine, not whether or not there is any benefit of cow urine, but the benefits are assumed when you begin with. And this is what the investigation in this paper also begins with. It begins with an assumption that there must be something good about cow urine because ancient texts say so. The authority of ancient texts here is uncritically accepted. So you're not doing science because skepticism, questioning received wisdom, and rejecting claims to authority are the starting points, I believe, of science. So, let me at the outset sort of say that I don't think one should think of science as a set of outcomes and pronouncements, because this is inevitably a question that gets asked. Isn't science also dogmatic? So if you define science simply in terms of what comes out of the ivory towers of the country's scientific establishment, which is not seen as just another authority that gives you a set of outcomes and pronouncements, just as the institutions of religion did at one point of time. And this is really not science. In fact, the very idea of science is antithetical to such an interpretation. The idea of a secular science, that spirit of inquiry that is so often quoted, has as its very basis an anti-authoritarian skepticism. Right? So this idea of science as another authority, as a set of outcomes and pronouncements, is in fact unscientific and further certain interests. It disempowers science because it is a process of social transformation that science can enable. That is its real power, that it enables us to question inequitable social relations, be they of caste or gender or race or religion, that form some of the biggest examples of irrationality and unreason that we live with on a daily basis. Right? So the process of science allows us to question these. And this is, I think, where the need for a people's science, I mean, and this is entirely the series of talks that have been organized are inspired by the people's science movement, by Mahavir Narwal, a comrade who was very much a part of this movement for a large part of his, till the end of his life. I think the very idea of people's science intersects with scientific temper here. And what I mean here by people's science and what the people's science movement also means is not some idea of some glorified traditional knowledge. That's not what people's science is, but it is a science for the people, a science whose full potential for human emancipation can be realized, a science which is not appropriated for profit to maintain social and economic hierarchies. So having said that, laid out that context of what I mean by scientific temper and people's science when I use those terms, let me try to lay down an argument for what I think is responsible for the weakening of scientific temper, where these attacks on reason come from and what they indicate. I know that I'm supposed to be talking about COVID-19, but frankly, I've been writing about vaccines lately, and I give this disclaimer when I do so that I'm not, that doctor before my name is just a PhD. I'm not a medical practitioner. So I am not really competent to talk about the zoonotic origins of the virus. I'm not a virologist. How the virus spreads, which medical theory about it is right or wrong, or whether how mutants behave, and whether there will be, vaccines will be less effective against mutants, etc. That's not what I can speak about. What I can speak about, however, is how society understands uncertainty, deals with newer, things like a pandemic or newer understanding in science when it's confronted by it. And I'll use COVID-19 as an example. And that's so COVID-19 is really going to be my hook to talk about science and scientific temper in society. So let me lay down my argument for the attack on pseudoscience first. I mean, and I think there are various strands. This has been said many times before. There are various strands of pseudoscience, some perhaps more immediately dangerous than others, many emerging from diverse political views, but I believe they all contribute to some extent or the other to the weakening of scientific temper in society, and consequently, therefore, to the strengthening of regressive, conservative, and discriminatory ideas and practices. Well, the first and the most, not the most, maybe the more easy threat to establish in this is the one where the anti-science sentiment ostensibly emerges from some aspect of faith. This aspect of anti-science is relatively easier to criticize because there is enough empirical evidence to prove that science works in explaining the natural world as well as in delivering humanity from disease and drudgery. So flat earthers, at least the older variety of flat earthers, are not very common. Now you still have, climate change deniers, you have anti-vaxxers, you have a whole range of science skeptics, but they don't necessarily, the faith is not the starting point necessarily for all of them. You have some of them there, but what we have right now, I think, is something that is not so easy anymore. The attack is much more insidious. We now have the language of science being appropriated to peddle pseudoscience. So the particular brand of pronouncements, either about Panchagavya or cancer curing homeopathic treatments or astrology, they all claim a basis in science. Right? They appropriate the language of science and claim to be knowledge systems that are alternative, but nevertheless scientific. So any questions that you raise about these are met with arguments that the critics of some of these things still have minds that are colonized by Western science. This was the argument that Ramdev gave when he recently criticized modern medicine, said that it's caused more problems in treating COVID than it's solved. So the argument is that our culture, traditions, and Vedas and have all the answers. And because these are the legacy of our collective Hindu ancestors, how can they be wrong? So the crux of the argument here is that these pseudoscientific claims are valid despite the lack of any evidence, because evidence itself is a product of Western science. So the entire concept of evidence itself and the framework of evidence is itself questioned. Now, this is a fallacious argument, of course, on many levels. And I also think, as an aside, that this attempt to dress up this knowledge from ancient history in the language of science itself is ironically an implicit acknowledgement of what scientific development has delivered, be it in terms of what we know of the natural world or the more accessible examples of declines in infant mortality, reduction in the number of women dying in childbirth, increase in life expectancy, etc. Or the fact that we have a COVID-19 vaccine now available in a year. You have researched, manufactured, and delivered vaccines, not just one, but multiple vaccine candidates in a span of less than a year. This is unprecedented. I don't know when in history we've had such a reaction to a pandemic. But in this sort of roundabout acknowledgement in their efforts to use the language of science, they miss the point completely that this is, and I think this is something we should be very careful about when we refute the attack from the cultural conservatives, simply based on empirical evidence that modern science works. So there's a tendency to say that it works. There's evidence that it works, and so it works. But what we should be careful about is when this language is appropriated to peddle pseudoscience, what it seeks to appropriate is the authority that science enjoys. There is no investment in the scientific method and the rejection of the authority that the method itself applies. But what they seek to appropriate is that authority that they see science enjoying. So I think that's why it's important to emphasize the reason for why science works, rather than simply citing examples of its having worked. Right? Why we reliance on the process of truth seeking that tries to find evidence, that tries to construct causal explanations, explore more evidence, and even find fault with one's own explanations of particular evidence. Right? The answers we have when we employ the scientific method are not complete. They may not be answers that we like or that we might have started out seeking in the first place. Or we may happen upon something that is unexpected, but which now has to be accounted for when we continue our analysis, when we try and explain something. It might also challenge some of the previous hypotheses. And this is an ongoing process. Science is not a newer authority which trumps all previous sources of authority simply because it gives a set of outcomes that are better. But it is better because the process that it employs to arrive at those outcomes is better, is more consistent, more honest, and therefore more reliable. But this question of consistency and reliability brings us inevitably to the question of uncertainty, which is inherent to the scientific method. So even as we gain knowledge, there are gaps in our understanding that remain. This uncertainty is a very fundamental aspect of the scientific worldview. And what I also think fundamentally separates faith and science. Faith offers certainty, whereas science cannot and does not. Should not. I won't say it does not, because we have people trying to at least offer certainty, even scientists trying to do it. But science inherently does not offer that certainty. It cannot offer that certainty. And I think the way in which this uncertainty is handled scientifically, socially, and politically is very important. This, I think, has been a real lesson during the pandemic in the last year, right? Because COVID is not the first new virus that we have seen. There are many new diseases that humanity has confronted from time to time. And we've learned something from each new experience, or theoretically, we should have learned something from each new experience. But there are going to be gaps in our knowledge about a new disease. When a new virus, we are confronted with a new virus, we are not going to know everything about it. We are likely to get some things wrong. We have to revise our understanding as we know better. And this uncertainty will be reflected in the discussions of the scientific community also. There will be a bunch of scientists who say something, there will be others who would disagree, and that debate and discussion is part of the scientific process. Saying that we don't know is not tantamount to saying we cannot do anything. But that acknowledgement of the fact that we don't know everything is the hallmark of the scientific method. And this uncertainty in science is also in itself not new to us. It's not new to science. Doing science means having to deal with uncertainty. And this might be inherent in the system that one is studying. If you're studying the universe, of course, there are uncertainties that are inherent in the what you're studying itself. And if you're studying society, there are uncertainties again in because there are the people you study have agency, and of course the methods that you employ to study also introduce uncertainty. So even in the everyday practice of science, you have estimations of error, sensitivity. They're important elements of communicating results. Right? And each branch of science has its own way of dealing with this uncertainty and communicating it. So when we're trying to understand a completely new, or at least a relatively new phenomenon, there is always going to be some debate, disagreement, reevaluation, improvement, failure, setbacks, trial and error. All of these are part of the process of science. But what we have today is science being monitored in real time, as they say, right? We have a media which fanatically looks for headlines. We have an all-knowing social media, and we have a political leadership that is driven by narcissistic posturing. All of these are unforgiving of uncertainty. Nothing but absolute knowledge is acceptable to them. Uh, Public health experts are held responsible for not knowing at all, or not knowing something well enough or early enough. They're also held responsible for hype and fear mongering. They're also accused of being stooges for big pharma. So they are everything all at once based on the same set of statements. And of course, based on who is evaluating them at any given point of time. That we've seen this, did scientists get it wrong? You must have seen headlines that say that, scientists are doubtful about. So as if, that's something new. It's okay if they get something wrong. They can get something wrong. They're allowed to get something wrong, right? That's exactly why what is so great about scientists, that they are not God. That they can do wrong. That is, in fact, something that is good about them. So anyway, so while I think that the concept of uncertainty is commonplace in science, society doesn't take to it very kindly. And because there's a certain discomfort in dealing with uncertainty. There's impatience with a lack of knowledge. We want certainty, and pseudoscience promises results. It promises certain results. So if you see the different drugs that are being tested for the treatment of COVID, and I'm not denying that we really have to deal with this problem, the crisis of evidence-based medicine that the pandemic has thrown up, the controversy over remdesivir, for example, ivermectin, the changing list of drugs that are on the approved list of the government. Even while acknowledging that some amount of this is bound to happen, there are undoubtedly problems with the way in which trial and error on patients has unfolded. And I'm not sort of, an expert on that. I'm not going into that, right? But if you look at the studies on drug trials that are presented, they're always presented with some assessment of probabilities, confidence levels, etc. There's high confidence that 25% of the patients in a certain category showed improvement or something like that. One can decide whether the sample was big enough or diverse enough. Okay, but you never see such statements from the promoters of Gomutra, Bhabiji ke Papad, these are but extremely ridiculous examples. You take examples that the general population considers less ridiculous. Say something like Coronil or Arsenicum album 30. Arsenicum album 30 was a homeopathic solution that was promoted by the government. No, it's not quite clear whether it was supposed to be again a prophylactic or a cure. And then they said that, no, it just boosts immunity. But even that, there is no evidence. There's no paper on Arsenicum album 30, at least not in the public domain, that shows that it boosts immunity. Okay, but then, you can say all of this and you say that this is there is 100% confidence. You don't have to say that it does this in 85% of the people or 23% of the people or 78% of the people. There is no such thing. It's 100%. Right? So to show this up for the fraud that it is, we need not only good science, but we also need good science communication. The science has to be communicated as a process of learning, and not as this process of, this set of final outcomes and proclamations. So unless one does this, communicate science properly, there will inevitably be accusations about science being just as authoritative as faith. And another aspect I think that is important here is that you have an unequal access to the benefits of scientific development. Pseudoscience is likely to flourish in a society where a large majority of our population cannot access the benefits of science. Successive governments have spent a shamefully dismal fraction of their budgets on public healthcare, have willfully handed over the sector to private companies who have shown now that they're incapable of stepping up in a crisis. And then what we do is we glorify the role of Ayush practitioners. So the gap between what is needed in terms of modern healthcare and what is available is so huge that people perhaps have no option but to turn to quackery. I'm not denying that there may be well-meaning, kind quacks out there. Not everybody is Ramdev. But nevertheless, it does not substitute for a well-functioning, universally available, affordable, modern healthcare system. If nothing else, the pandemic at least should have taught us that much. Right? People don't need to die of a chest infection due to lack of oxygen. And when that is what they need, your arsenicum album and coronal have absolutely no role to play. Right? So I think it is important to emphasize that the benefits of modern science and their equitable the distribution of those benefits is really essential. But this still does then raise another question of the attack on science that we see in the global north, where the benefits of modern medicine are more easily accessible. We have seen its impact in society. Yet there is a section, and some may argue that it's a growing one in the north, that is anti-science. Right? And this is not your typical Trump-supporting white conservative, the counterpart of the upper caste Modi supporter in India, who have their own political motivations. This is a politically progressive group, vocal against the cultural conservatives from the broad sort of left, if you will. Okay? So this is a group that equates science and technology with capitalism. The suspicion of big private capital, the military state, etc., translates to their rejection of science and technology itself. So you have the anti-maskers, the anti-vaxxers, the pandemic conspiracy theorists. They have been supported by sections from the political left as well, who confuse the appropriation of technology. And I think, my argument is that it is a confusion. The appropriation of technology for profit as an attribute of the science itself. And even in India, this confusion of science and technology, which with its social ownership has led to all kinds of anti-science narratives emerging from what would otherwise be progressive sections of society. So you have indigenous knowledge that is exalted and glorified and elevated to a pedestal, while one ignores the condition of people living with disease and drudgery without the benefits of modern technology. Right? And all of this kind of life is considered a virtue. I get very irritated when people talk about Indian lifestyle, the lifestyle of the poor. The poor don't have a lifestyle. They have a way of life that is forced upon them by their economic circumstances. To elevate it to that pedestal is really a problem. And in fact, the blame then for drudgery and disease is laid at the doorstep of science. Not the inequitable access to the benefits of scientific development are not considered the problem. This is the disease and drudgery is considered an outcome of scientific development itself. We have seen this even in the case of COVID. The idea that the pandemic is some sort of revenge by nature, set off by the unrestrained exploitation by capitalism. And there is an assumption here of some imagined harmonious relationship that humanity is supposed to have shared with nature in the past, as if we all lived nicely, happily with in some harmony with nature in the past. So there is therefore a skepticism of science that is opportunistic, that emerges from the far right. And there is skepticism of science that is confused, in my opinion, that emerges from the far left. And this, I think, the confusion of science and its ownership benefits the cultural and political right wing. It does not benefit, it benefits them politically. It does not benefit the left. It does not further the cause of a more just and equitable world. In fact, I think it hinders it. And if you've seen the far right trying to capitalize on all of this, the anti-vaccine campaigns in Europe, for example, and similar, the peddlers of obscurantism here in India, from Ayurveda to homeopathy, they feel free to do and say as they please, as they capitalize on the disillusionment of the people with a modern healthcare system that they have either no access or very, very limited access to. Right? So I think it's important that we remember that COVID has come at a time when globally the attacks on science and on scientific temper were at an all-time high. We were doing marches for science across the world and protesting the assassination of rationalists in India before the pandemic hit, if you all remember. And this has happened with the political rise of conservatives globally. Modi, Bolsonaro, Trump, of course, now out of power, but of course his politics lives on, Erdogan. You have all of these leaders for whom, science is only about its outcomes. They don't reject it in the same manner as faith leaders of an earlier time did. They're quite happy to accept the outcomes of science. Of course, some outcomes more than others. Their understanding, however, does not reconcile with the process and practice of science. So they have this relationship with modern science on the one hand and pseudoscience on the other hand. The Prime Minister will praise the ICMR and Indian vaccine manufacturers on one hand, and his health minister will go and launch Coronel with Ramdev on the other. They don't see a contradiction in this. For them, science is also something that is to be confined to the laboratory, serving narrow class interests, which can then conveniently be converted to nationalistic slogans, Atmanirbhar Bharat, for instance. Scientific temper, however, is a concept that threatens the agenda of these political conservatives because it takes science beyond the laboratory. Right? This is, what I said right at the beginning, connecting it to the concept of people's science, where doing science isn't reduced simply to a set of differential equations to be solved in the confines of world-class universities. It can come to the streets and be part of people's lives, and it can be the basis of cultural transformation. And this brings me to what my final point. Do I have time? A few more minutes?
Yeah, sure.
So one of my final points that I want to make, that is a reaction to this attack on scientific temper. How do we confront it? Right? And excepting a few individuals and political organizations, many others have had very muted reactions to these attacks on science. And in some cases, they have even actively supported pseudoscience. Right? Sabrimala is an example. So at a time when a majoritarian political agenda is in ascendance, what has happened is, unfortunately, we have a weak liberal intelligentsia that has fallen back on what they perceive as softer or more inclusive narratives of religion and tradition. There's a tendency to dismiss the more radical and militant positions against pseudoscience as being cut off from people's realities. These are elitist positions. While the RSS appeals to the baser tendencies of religious fanaticism, they deride modernity as Western and elite, and they spin this one-sided narrative of India's history. You have large sections of the opposition that have tried to respond to it by trying to weave an equally lopsided narrative of tolerance and inclusion from within religious thought. That Hinduism has, but what they say Hinduism is not really what Hinduism is. Hinduism is in fact more tolerant. It is in fact more, it was in fact even progressive. I mean, there are people who have argued that as well. And this then, the opposition then is caught in their own narrative. They have to downplay the discriminatory nature of our so-called traditions, end up sort of glorifying them. So the objectivity of science ends up being labeled as elite and disconnected, and is offered up as a sacrifice at the altar of obscurantism, simply because obscurantism is perceived to be validated by the majority. So I think it becomes important as a reaction to this attack is that we must not forget that the ideas of inclusion, pluralism, equality have come from struggle. They have not come from this benign acceptance of the lesser evil. The fight for a truly just society was not led by those glorifying religion and traditions, either rabidly or softly. It was led by those who confronted these traditions, rebelled, and struggled for a just world. Now, even the weaker manifestations, understanding of secularism, get space because of the more radical fights against religious dogma and obscurantism. So standing up to the agenda of majoritarian appropriation, therefore, I think requires strong movements that are not afraid of taking militant positions on rationality. So I think to end, I would say that the fight for reason and rationality, I think, goes hand in hand with the fight for people's rights. It will, in fact, be a betrayal of the people if we do not address this as part of our movements, simply because pseudoscience is part of people's beliefs or cultures. There is a tendency to do this more brazenly and opportunistically in some political organizations as compared to others. But present to, I think, to a certain extent, I think in all progressive political organizations also. It comes from confusing what I think a people's program really is and letting the cultural conservatives set the agenda in terms of public debate. The idea should be to push the envelope of public consciousness, not validate false consciousness. So I think, I stop there. I think I've taken many detours. So if you think a short 2-minute summary will be useful, or should we just go to question answers so that we can have a longer discussion?
Maybe we can move over to discussion because I'm sure there's lots to talk about.
Sure.
Thank you, Dr. Kanitkar, for that talk. If there are any questions, please just unmute your mic and ask away.
I have a question. Yeah, hi. Sure. So can you go ahead? Okay. Yeah. Thanks for the very wonderful talk, Tejal. So one of my questions is like, what kind of in more concrete terms, what kind of roles do you perhaps possibly envision for scientists in society? I mean, also given the fact that the current state of people, so basically what kind of activities do you perhaps possibly envision that scientists could potentially play in the times of COVID, right? I mean, especially going on the ground can sometimes seem like a very abstract term. So that's the first question. And the second question, I think caught me rather found me quite interesting was your attack on a certain kind of radical left, I mean, quote unquote radical left in terms of its skepticism of science, right? I mean, would you also kind of see this as like an impact that kind of comes from kind of postmodern turn and the post-colonial turn as far as theorization is concerned and in the West? And also we see a lot of that in India, right? It's not purely that kind of critique is not really exactly in the West. I mean, we see this kind of the post-colonial, postmodern criticism of science even in India kind of getting very dominant in the last few decades. So yeah.
Okay. Okay, so should I take the second one first? That's an easier one to answer than the first one. I mean, I think it is quite clear that the social sciences, in fact, I mean, a lot of it comes from, let's say that there is part of it that is, I would say, a valid criticism of the scientific establishment in this country. It has been extremely limited. The access to science education, the access to science has been extremely limited. The fight for diversity in campuses, increasing diversity in campuses has been very, inadequate. It's starting now. You see campuses, science campuses, engineering campuses starting to speak about diversity, caste, gender, etc. now. But it's been, many years, these have been extremely exclusive spaces. And so I think one needs to understand why there is this criticism, why is there this understanding of the scientific community? And then, as being, if your understanding of science is not going to lead to social change, then obviously there is a problem with that understanding itself. So I think to a certain extent, understanding why this criticism emerges is necessary. But I think the more I mean, if one sort of puts it in this perspective, then your criticism leads you to the practice of science in an extremely fragmented and unequal society that India is, not to a critique of the science itself, right? And that the critique of the science coming from a lot of it coming from a postmodern sort of post-colonial critical theory, all of these critical strands of modernity. I think emerging first in the global north, but then very uncritically, I think, applied also in India. There is a context in India which has to be understood. I think the disillusionment has to be understood, and the shortcomings of the scientific community do have a role to play. But I think it's also that social scientists are not held to the same standards sometimes when it comes to some of these. I've said this before in some lectures that scientists of ISRO who go to Tirupati before the launch of a rocket are criticized, and they should be criticized. Right? But when you have when social scientists glorify tradition, as people's people's consciousness, that is not criticized. So they're not held to the same standards. So while I think it is, the scientists are responsible, I think there is a serious problem. I used to earlier think that it is only the academia. The problem is only in academia. But the problem in academia is really becoming a big one, where you have, because what it does, it feeds directly into the hands of the political right. We've seen that happen now also. So, that brings me to the first question, which I think, to an extent where I said that scientists have not, taken up this fight. I mean, we have had science movements. I'm not saying that we haven't. We've had scientists who've understood the importance of this, and but this has the movement nevertheless has remained restricted, and over the last few years, in fact, its role in the public space has reduced. I think it's necessary for younger scientists with the March for Science, etc., and a lot of these movements, especially given the global ascendancy of majoritarian right-wing conservatism. I think some of this is sort of consolidating a younger leadership as well, and that's a good sign. It's a good thing. But I think much more needs to be done. And in India specifically, I think the science movement, scientists have to be much, much more vocal about diversity, about the problem of caste, about the problem of gender, about all of the social irrationalities. I think it's not enough to simply speak about superstition and going to the streets with superstition. I think that's an important aspect that our science movements have worked on, and we should continue to work on them. But I think a larger narrative and support and discourse has to be built about the social irrationalities that we live with on a daily basis. They have to be confronted and questioned. This, I think, we haven't done adequately enough, and I think we should take this up quite seriously.
A lot to this.
Can I say something?
Sure.
Yes.
Hi. Well, I'm Suresh Ratan. I'm speaking from Denmark. Good lecture, Tejal. I also try to deal with these issues, especially when I have students from India or when I visit India and deal. My main problem is that even our professional scientists in their daily living, they show very little of scientific way of life. And they create all this beautifully articulated spirituality and this and that nonsense. Can we combine science and religion? You should say something about it. Because whenever I try to stick my neck out that these two things cannot be compatible and they shouldn't be, people don't like that. At the private level, they would like, oh, where do I get peace of mind and all that, whatever. So combination of science and society and science and way of life under the garb of spirituality and all that thing, I would like to hear what you think about it.
No, I agree with you completely. I don't think that they can. It is what is it called? Cognitive dissonance. I think definitely, if you're doing science and if you sort of practice irrationality in your daily life, you can try and justify it. But I'm sure it's a problem. And I have said this before, where when people from the science movement only have told me that it's not really, we should be careful about making a differentiation, differentiating different strands of pseudoscience and belief and things like that. I mean, your poor professor from a local science college who does work for the science movement, but he's not an atheist. He does believe and does do something at home. What is the point of attacking him? But I think that there has to be a larger discussion. You don't go after people individually and attack them, obviously, but there has to be a larger discussion of the fact that there is a dissonance between the practice of science in the laboratory and in the university, and what you do outside of the university in your personal space. And I don't think this sort of contradiction really works. It, in fact, I think, undermines the role of science in society when scientists are seen to be practicing practicing science, religion outside of the home. Because you see, I think Friedman was the one who said it, that once you do science and you confront uncertainty, you don't practice religion, or you don't believe, you might still believe in God, but you don't believe in God in the same way. But I think we should take it with a little pinch of salt. I mean, that kind of an understanding, because I think it does impact society. And you see this with, rationalists like Dawkins and Neil deGrasse Tyson also, that for them, then science conquers all. Even if you are, that this is another variety, I would say, of atheists who don't practice religion, but who don't see the role of science in society and in social transformation. They separate these two aspects of science and society. So you have atheists also who do it, who then are okay with justifying personal belief. Okay? They don't see the contradiction. They don't see the fact that what happens when you have a scientist who opposes interfaith marriage of his own child, right? How does science justify that? What happens when you have scientists who think women can't do science, or women shouldn't do science and engineering? Now, there is an obvious dissonance here, which has to be dealt with, and there has to be a discourse that attacks this directly. You might not say anything about your local, science college principal who believes in God. I mean, why go after him or her? Poor thing. But if you don't have a discourse that also talks about this, then that local science college principal does not have the means to also question his or her own beliefs. So I think there has to be, what you say, this calling out of this nonsense at some level. It might not happen necessarily at the level of the movement, but there has to be a discourse that exists that calls this out as well. I would say a militantly materialist discourse has to be there, which allows then for a more softer approach towards dealing with a lack of agency amongst people in changing their beliefs. I don't know. I think that was a very confused and roundabout way of saying I agree with you, but.
Okay, so the Hansika has a question which she had put in the chat box. So I'll just ask it for her because her connection is a little flickery. So her question is about whether there have been successful examples of people science, and if they can be used as a backbone for citizen science programs being developed.
I don't quite understand what she means by examples of people's science, but the if you want examples close to home, what Anis has managed to do, what the People's Health Movement has managed to do in many places in terms of specific, addressing specific forms of superstition and obscurantism, especially that are, black magic, etc., that are directly dangerous for women, especially in rural India. I think there has been a lot of success of the people's movement in dealing with some of these things. There is, I think the way in which this is done also, and some of this was discussed, I think, in last week's lecture. I couldn't attend it then because I had another commitment, but I saw the lecture later. And I think some of it was discussed, right? That you have what is a debate of, what is an environment of debate and reasoning, etc., that you take to the people. You don't take do's and don'ts to the people, right? You don't take a set of pronouncements to the people, because there's assumption that people don't know, and people are not scientific, or people believe in certain practices because they don't know. This entire attitude towards doing or taking science to the people, I think, is something that the People's Science Movement has successfully questioned. And the methods that they have employed of actually trying to create an environment of debate, of discussion, of reasoning, I think that has that over a period of time. It's not something that happens easily. It's not something that happens overnight. I think it happens over a period of time. So I think these are some of the examples of people's science. But I mean, that's what when we say people's science, this is what I mean by it. That it's not as if people do a different science as compared to what is done in the lab. Right? I mean, this is a binary of traditional alternative knowledge, people's knowledge, and the knowledge of the scientific establishment. When you say people's science, it is that the science itself is something that is for the people and of the people. It's not as if people don't that they are not given access to it is a problem. It's not as if that it is controlled and appropriated for private profit. Modern science, that is a problem. It's not as if it's removed from the people because it is something different that the people can't do. Yeah.
Professor Ramanujan would like to come in.
She's sorry. Just 1 second. I think she's said something on the chat which I can now read. Thinking about taking science out of the labs to the people for them to do and implement. So that is one thing, taking science out of the labs, but also bringing people into the science labs. I think it has to be thought of both ways. And this is what I meant by increasing diversity in our universities, increasing the number of our universities. This entire merit-based understanding of world-class universities, etc., has to be confronted. The privatization of our universities has to be confronted and challenged. And we have to increase. The minute you have a more diverse student crowd entering the university, what do? You increase the fees to restrict the kind of discussion, debate, etc., that happens on universities. So I think, it's not just about taking science out of the lab, but making the lab itself more open, more accessible, more, because some science can be done only in the lab, not on the street. So it's, this entire understanding that you teach the farmer's child in the farm and you teach the city kid in the university, that binary, I think we need to oppose. And one of the ways in which I think what we should do to increase access to science is to fight against the privatization of our universities, to fight for increased access, increased diversity, and increased strength of the universities. The idea that small 20 people classrooms are better, you can reach to, you can interact more, etc., I think are outdated ideas. It's not as if I think we have a duty to reach to large. We have a huge deficit of education in this country. We have a duty to reach larger number of people. And this entire discourse on merit, I think, has to be challenged in order to be able to really universalize the idea of science.
Hi, can I ask a question? Hi.
Yes, please.
Yeah, this is Siddesh here. So I joined late, so I don't know whether it is covered. Is it possible to quantify scientific temper? Has any study being done? How many people follow scientific temper in India, and whether it will be useful to know this statistic? Yeah.
Yeah,
Hello.
I don't know. Yeah. I don't know. So I would say that there have been surveys, for example, that try and look at how many people believe in certain things, right? But typically in research of this kind, I'm a little skeptical, because you have to be. There are also various reasons why people believe what they do. It's not simply enough to say that there are so many percentage of people who believe in something. Right? When it comes to belief, it is also important to investigate why they believe what they do, and that's how you understand whether the place from which it comes, how much of that understanding, that response is valid or not valid. Some of it, for example, you take COVID-19. A lot of surveys, telephonic surveys were done on COVID-19, and people were asked whether they think it's real, whether it's just a flu, whether it's something so lethal that you have to do, whatever. And a lot of the responses of the people, a lot of people, for example, thought that it is all just hype, right? And it's just some flu, and we don't need all of this. A lot of it came from a very deep mistrust of the government. It's not necessarily coming from a place of mistrust in science per se. Right? It's not as if they won't go to the doctor, or they'll go to the they won't take medicines that the doctor has prescribed, or they'll whatever. Of course, as long as it's economically affordable. But it comes from a mistrust in a government that has let them down time and again on so many different fronts. So, do you call this a lack of scientific temper? Right? When the African American community in the US refused to take vaccines earlier, I mean, there were surveys also that were done that showed that a lot of African Americans were not taking vaccines, because they said, we don't know what the Trump fellow has has done and what he's going to give us. Now, this comes from a mistrust of the political leadership, right? But it also, there is enough anti-vaccine sentiment in the US. It also comes from, belief and obscurantism and, whatever, some pseudoscientific understanding of what vaccination is supposed to be. So that's why, I mean, there is, so quantifying scientific temper is not, I think, so easy. But I think historically you can see some kind of a shift, right? And this is what I said in my talk, that there is some amount of progress. I would not say it is adequate, but it is non-trivial. Whereas it's not easy enough to say that you should do something or not do something because the priest says so. You have to find some convoluted scientific explanation for why you should not eat during an eclipse, or why you should grow a tulsi plant in your house, that it absorbs oxygen or whatever. And what all the cow does is supposed to be explained, is explained using the scientific language. So it's not enough to say that it is because while the scriptures are used as a source of authority, their authority is validated by saying that they knew science, that they did science, right? So there is a collapsing of that authority with the authority that they perceive people actually, portray onto science. So there is, I would say it's a complicated question. Maybe in certain very specific aspects where there are movements, for example, that are targeting certain specific practices, there can be some idea of how many people believe, why they believe in this. Largely about scientific temper, I would say it's a little difficult to do.
Professor
Hello.
Raman,
Sorry, yeah.
Yes, Shantan, would you go ahead and ask your question?
Thank you. So, Tejal, thank you for the talk. So because we're talking about COVID-19 and because we're talking about pseudoscience, so recently I've been sort of studying the history of I've been sort of comparing and contrasting the two pandemics that India has had to face. One of them being the COVID-19 pandemic, and the other one being the HIV/AIDS pandemic in the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s. And from my reading, I observed two glaring differences. One glaring difference is so while during the COVID-19, we have people from the government putting out their support for pseudoscience. You'd be surprised to know that the same Harshvardhan who goes and pats Ramdev on the back for talking about coronil is the same Harshvardhan who in 1994 took a anti-Kiran Bedi stance and said that AIDS is more dangerous than homosexuality, and therefore, when prisoners in Tihar jail were not allowed access to condoms under Kiran Bedi's supervision, because sort of that would, quote unquote, increase immoral stuff in the Tihar prison, the same Harshvardhan actually said that no, it's important to sort of disburse condoms there because AIDS is more dangerous than homosexuality. And he, in fact, sort of gave a comment to his law secretary to look whether the law, and by the law we mean Section 377, to be changed. So the first question would then be what has changed that sort of brings out such a huge pseudoscience support from the government, and especially from the same person over 20 years or so. And the second question, the second glaring difference that you observe between the two pandemics is the speed at which a resolution was achieved. And for the COVID-19, it was about a year that the vaccine was present, and for HIV/AIDS, it has been at least 30 years, more than 30 years that the virus was first discovered, and we still don't have a vaccine, barring one which has gone to phase 1 trials last week. So do you think that simply because of the population that HIV/AIDS is perceived to affect, I mean, is that a more social drive towards what kind of science should be pursued?
Yeah, frankly, I think somebody who's worked in people's health and seen these issues closely is much better qualified to answer that question as to why we see a difference. I mean, broadly, I would say that you see that across different diseases, right? Something like TB, for example, is also something that we deal with in such a poor manner. And it's largely because of in my opinion, at least because of the population that it is perceived to affect. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it was the same with HIV/AIDS as well, but I'm not very conversant with what kind of developments have happened on the vaccines and cures on that front. So I wouldn't, and what has been not driving it. I do remember the debates about the drugs for HIV and generic pharma, and they being made available, the TRIPS agreement, all of this that has been repeated with the pandemic and what has happened now. There seems to be a significant difference. But then I would say that, somebody somebody from People's Health, if I don't know if somebody who's here, might know much better than me. I might be able to comment more authentically on that. On the first question of, it's the same people that you see taking a different kind of politically convenient view. And this is what I meant by the fact that you don't have, it's not as if it's the same kind of rejection of science that you saw at an earlier time. Here you have this convenient acceptance, convenient marriage with science, and a convenient, propagation of pseudoscience as well. As long as the cocktail that you have furthers a political agenda, and that political agenda is, it's not really religious. The Hindutva is a political agenda, right? It's a you can call it a proto-fascist or whatever, authoritarian agenda, but it is, it is political in nature. And then religion or religious belief just serves to, as a particular tool in a particular environment and circumstance. It's not, we just happen to be Hindu majoritarian, but it's not necessarily the crux of what drives public discourse. So I don't see that it is very surprising that you have a change in position, right? Between that Harshvardhan took a different position at different, at least relatively different position then, as compared to the kinds of things he's been saying now. It's not very surprising because, they do what is convenient. I mean, the way in which, if you see all of the prime minister's addresses to the nation, right, you have everything. It comes from this. You have the yoga day, you have some traditions, some sort of glorification of ancient history, etc., weaved into with a narrative of applauding your doctors, applauding ICMR, applauding vaccine manufacturers. So you have a mix of all of that. So it's very conveniently packaged for different, different sections of the electorate that typically this particular political regime tries to move.
Tejal, Jam would like to say something.
Sure.
And then there's the chat. There's a student who's asking a question, a comment and a question, Amartya. So first, Professor Ramanujan, and then we'll go to the chat. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. Lovely listening to you, Tejal. Am I audible? Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to add a couple of points. One, we're talking about this erasing the line separating science and pseudoscience, and we talked about that. And I also wanted to add another thing that's happening, which is also, propagate a new higher kind of pseudoscience by grafting spiritual concepts onto modern science. There's a whole lot of stuff with quantum consciousness, and you talk about positive energy and negative energy and huge amount of stuff. Now, this is also something that becomes almost very seductive, and this is something that, since there are many students, I think it's something to take not lightly, because you can easily go down a whole lot of fairly nonsensical things. Another one, which is really, when one of the students was asking about examples of people's science, I wanted to say that, it's not only about, it's science that people own. Right? I mean, one of my favorite examples is the India Mark III hand pump. I mean, when people ask about India's contributions to technology, invariably people take examples of Mangalyaan, Chandrayaan. Okay, one should take pride in such achievements. But, think of things like oral polio vaccine. Oral polio vaccine, the kind of difference it has made to, children all over the country, and the kind of distribution system that India came up with for that. Now, of course, we have messed up royally in vaccines, but OPV was one of the great successes of India that which taught the world. And Mark III hand pump is very important. When I was a child, growing up in Trichy, I remember, pumps are things that as a young boy, I would climb onto it and, pump down. That is the sort of thing that used to be done. It take a lot of energy to pump. Today, you can see, a pregnant woman in the rural areas holding a baby on one hand and pumping with the other, right? And the Mark III, this is India Mark III. It's called the India Mark III hand pump, and it is used all over Africa. And the kind of energy saving it has done for women carrying water in rural areas, this, I can go on and on. I just wanted to say that if you want examples of people's science, there is plenty. There is plenty that actually makes a difference in the everyday lives of people. And you can, the person who asked about quantification, you can actually quantify, very good energy calculations you can sit and do, and how much, energy saving is actually done through these. So there is plenty of people's science. So when we say science, when Tejal was earlier talking about science of the people and for the people and so on, there's technology all over the place. Somehow we have this passion for, high-tech science, or, we want it to be something like a product like Zoom or Facebook or whatever, or Mangalyaan, or bombs that explode and kill people. So I think it's a matter of how we view science and technology and what it means for people as such, for you and me, for everybody, especially for humanity across. And I think that is what I would say are examples of people science. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree. I agree completely. I think one of the sad things is that we have, in some sense, curtailed ourselves. This entire idea that intellectual work and manual work is separate. No, in the majority community, there has been a separation in these two things, and therefore you have the scientific the science establishment, the university, that glorifies mathematical work, models, etc. But in terms of technology, we have, unfortunately, a capitalist class also that is extremely incapable of producing technology at a required rate. That's it's a self-defeating proposition, unfortunately. Just to respond to the chat, the last comment, I think that's exactly what I said, that the African American communities, skepticism of the vaccine comes from a mistrust of the government because of a particular reason, because of their mistreatment. It's not obscurantism, so one has to understand why people believe the way they do. So, I don't disagree with what you've said. Ganesh Naik.
Amartya has a comment and a question, and he has a network replica. Would you read it? Shall I read it out for you, or? Sure.
So, should I read it? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Whatever works.
Okay, my question has to do with the portrayal and recognition of science in everyday life. We often see God being glorified and being thanked for and given credit for when there are real people, such as researchers, firefighters, etc., behind the actual solution. So if there's a pandemic and it's not going well, doctors and scientists are blamed. Once things come under control, some sort of control, then we see people thanking God, or Modi in our case. Why does this tendency arise in the first place? Is it because, as you said, that the need for a certainty is just that much? And moreover, how do we counter this? Of course, there will always be some sentiment and intuition of an unknown playing a hand in events. But how do we recognize as a society that this is not something that is opaque and not understandable? And rather than attributing things to God or other superstitious forces, just be a bit more rational. Is it even possible for such a shift to happen, knowing human tendencies? I think we have plenty of evidence that it is possible, right? I mean, there has been quite a sea shift in societies across the world. I think science, where this understanding of science is being sort of this fundamentally, the secular science is being fundamentally anti-authoritarian, has taken root. I think it has not only sort of displaced faith, religion, etc., as the overarching elements of or whatever overarching sources of knowledge, either for knowing the origin of life or what happens in the natural world, but they've also been displaced in terms of their say in organizing society, right? In the hierarchical organization of society, the role that religion, etc., played has also been pushed back with the advent of science and the recognition of this idea of science. So I don't. In fact, I would say that there is no reason to be pessimistic. We have enough empirical evidence to say that it's not really human tendency to do this. There is enough evidence that we can overcome that tendency. Even if we see that that is sort of maybe a majority tendency right now, there are enough societies where that has it has been overcome. Even in our own country, we have examples where at one point of time, people were skeptical about you have television programs saying don't go out during the eclipse, or showing certain programs to prevent people from going out during an eclipse. In 5 years, the same channel was showing programs basically asking people to go out during an eclipse, telling them that it's not a problem, it's not it's okay, all of this is really based in it's superstition. So that kind of shift and change we have seen happen in our society. So there's no reason for pessimism. You just have to fight.
Mr. Ramakrishnan has a question. Would you like to unmute and ask?
Okay, thanks. Hi. So we have seen this vaccine hesitancy among some people, and particularly one of it, the Covishield. And the reason that I have had from my friends who have shown this vaccine hesitancy against Covishield particularly is that, there are reports of it being, having blood clots. They are fully aware that these are random correlations, or the numbers are equal to random, but still they are unwilling to take the vaccine because they don't want to be in that risk category. Now, would this be a case of being unscientific? How do we, this kind of situation does come across in many instances. So the decision part versus the uncertainty. So how do we see this?
And I think, this is with not just with the vaccines, with you have it with the genetically modified foods, with nuclear, you have this, how is it that risk in a society gets distributed? How is it that people perceive that risk being distributed, right? And that has, so I don't necessarily think that vaccine hesitancy in this regard comes only from obscurantism or a disbelief in science. I think there are there are people, for example, who say that this is all a big pharma conspiracy, pandemic, etc., etc. They introduced the virus so that they could make money from the vaccines. That I would say is obscurantism. But to say that, okay, there is a certain percentage which is less than what, if you look at the studies, the people who face this is, the percentage of people who have faced this is less than what the population you would encounter in the non-vaccinated population. And that's what some studies say. But one can argue that, I have some fear of this, and there is enough there are these are all emergency approvals. We don't know yet what's going to happen with the vaccinated population by next year. In normal times, we would have waited for a year at least, or 2 years, to see what the effects are. And so I want to precautionary principle, I want to err on the side of caution. And so there is, I wouldn't say that this comes from obscurantism necessarily. I would say that there is always a balance that we try to strike in taking certain personal medical decisions. And that's one of the reasons why I think, there has been a lot of discussion, even in the people's health movement, about the fact that you should not make the vaccine mandatory. I think it's necessary to talk about what its benefits are, what the costs are, what the benefits are. But all of this ends up being at the macro level, right? When you say that, okay, if there are enough number of people who get vaccinated, there are enough, then you will prevent COVID deaths, and your likelihood of severe COVID infection, if it's higher, then your likelihood of getting a reaction from the vaccine, then taking the vaccine is a better option. See, but the thing is that we don't necessarily make these calculations, when we take personal medical decisions. You would have somebody who was probably a little scared of taking the vaccine earlier, has seen what has happened in the second wave, is now more willing to take it. So it's, some of it is simply the way in which you experience it. I wouldn't club all of it as obscurantism. It is vaccine hesitancy. Some of the vaccine hesitancy, not all of it is invalid. Some of it is understandable, I think, and it can be addressed by a much more healthier public debate about it, discussion. You have doctors, your epidemiologists, virologists, immunologists who work on all of this, have healthy public debates, discussions, let them speak about it, let them answer questions. That's how we are going to address some of these issues. And because people are going to have questions. They are not all invalid questions.
Hello, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah, so I'm a student from Kerala, and what I have observed in my high school, okay, basically even science teachers take an unscientific take on social matters. Okay, do you think it's the problem with the society, or is something that related to how they are trained? Okay, yeah.
I think it's a problem across the board. No, not just why single out science teachers, poor things. I mean, I have never had a discussion on science or the philosophy of science in any classroom I've ever been, right? Where I was studying. My entire education has been in science and engineering. Not a single classroom that I have ever been in, I have been exposed to any discussion on the philosophy of science or anything. Science is something that is, like I said, confined to the laboratory, to a specific set of equations and outcomes. So it's not, the understanding of it as a method is not part of any discussion in the science classroom. And so application in the social sciences is even, is out of the question, because that's even that's a bigger problem, right? When you're trying to when you apply the same principles of questioning, of critical skepticism to society, you're questioning all kinds of things that allow you a certain sense of comfort. Right? Uncertainty about things in social life is very, very unsettling, very discomforting. And people would like to avoid it. So religion, faith regulates your social life. You leave that behind when you go to the lab. You do science in the lab, you come out and you have something here that regulates your social life again. And that's a very comfortable situation, especially if you are in a situation of privilege in that organization of society. If you're women, for example, across any religion, you're going to eventually try and use that science to question something, as long as it doesn't hurt other privileges, right? So that's why one of the things that I said is a larger diversity in the science classroom actually forces these discussions. Again, the discussions go beyond the discussions on science. They become about the practice of science. So a diverse science classroom, I think, is I keep coming back to it, but I think it is really a huge issue which we have not really addressed so far, or we've addressed inadequately, I think. And we really need to do this because I agree that science teachers are also not immune from this. And
they even reinforce their prejudices onto students. They take moral classes for them, pointing out if the students are in some relationship with some other student, they'll point even inside the class, they'll condemn the student, saying that it's bad to take part in such an activity. And
No, sir, and they will not also. So the thing is that you don't apply, even when you, let's say you do good science in the lab, right? You're doing some decent work, very good research, it's very, whatever, very good. But you don't apply those principles to society, because, you can have opinions about society. You don't need to do social science. This idea that anybody can understand, so you have basically right now, a mathematician who's making a supermodel for the Department of Science and Technology that has not got a single prediction about COVID-19 right? He's a mathematician sitting there, call it a supermodel. Okay, so you don't, so forget social science, an epidemiologist, a sociologist who will understand, how these, because something like a transmission of the virus is dependent on social interaction and things like that. So you need people who know this. Simply because you can put a set of equations together and do math doesn't mean you understand society. This idea that scientists, because you're a scientist, because you've done science, you somehow also have some God-given right to proclaim your opinions as valid when it comes to society, is something that needs questioning, when it comes to the scientists. I think that's across the board. And, the local engineering or local science colleges in a lot of states, there's a lot of other burden that doesn't allow for this kind of discussion and debate. I think the bigger problem is these so-called world-class universities, where in fact the change should start. And you don't have it. We've recently had a case of severe discrimination in IIT Kanpur, I think it was. No, this is faculty who was using caste slur against students. Yeah, so really horrible stuff. So anyway,
Aishwarya, please ask.
Kharagpur, IIT Kharagpur. Sorry, the mathematician was from IIT Kanpur.
Technically a computer scientist. Sorry.
Yeah. That's theoretical computer science. So it's math / computer science, but yeah. Not to impinge on the stellar reputation of mathematicians in this country. Yeah.
Good
evening, Professor. Yeah. Good evening, Professor. Thank you so much for that talk. My question was really, I think it's been asked before, but I would like to place context to it. So you had for this Sabrimala issue, for instance, you had the Supreme Court saying that it is unconstitutional and was on the basis of equality and non-discrimination. Now, on the other hand, you also had this victory of sorts where you said that is saying that menstruation is impure is quite bizarre, and that's something that the verdict kind of did. But at the same time, you had this cultural opposition, quite violent opposition from the people's part, from the popular people's part, and you saw that difference between what is constitutionally valued, scientifically valued, and then you come to culture. So how do you really bridge that gap? And I mean, how long will it take to bridge that gap?
I think, it is, we've had that always, right? We've had a much more progressive constitution than society, always. And that's the difference, that you should actually have a state that is much more progressive, even though you have belief in obscurantism and regressive social practices within society. It's not something that the state should validate. Unfortunately, right now, I think what a lot of people are concerned about is that you have the state validating some of this regressive, some of these regressive practices. You have people who are RBI governors, who are, High Court judges, say things that are problematic about menstruation, about beef eating being the reason for, floods and things like that. So that's one of the problems. But we've always had this issue, and there have been various things, right? I mean, you have had very powerful people's movements, Periyar, for example, even Ambedkar attacked Hinduism, not just caste, but Hinduism as the basis in which, the caste is the basis, discriminatory social organization as the basis of the majority religion in this country, in a time where more people believed. It's not as if there were less people who believed, and there were more possibly more practicing Hindus than you have now. And it's not as if he got lynched, no. So, we could lead a movement that transformed the lives of many people. That you've had really huge social movements right from before independence that have had some major impacts in allowing us to progress in leaps and bounds. But we've not had really a radical social transformation, the kind that many other countries have had. And so therefore we it's almost as if you feel as if you go 2 steps forward and you take 1 step behind, and then again, so you sort of go 2 steps forwards. And that's why I said that, this entire thing that you can successfully oppose this kind of relentless attack on science by taking positions that derive from softer narratives from religion itself, right? Moderate Hinduism versus fanatical Hinduism, etc., won't work. You need to have very radical militant opposition to this, like Periyar's opposition, like Ambedkar's opposition to some of these practices. I think that pushes societies faster towards enlightenment than this sort of trying to say that, okay, but people believe, so let me sort of be, let me be nice about it. I don't think that works.
That's clarified. Thank you so much.
Any last questions? Ganesh Naik, would you like to unmute and ask that question?
Yes. So my question was, so how do you suggest countering this obscurantism in WhatsApp, coming from so-called educated people, or by educated, I mean, just people with degrees, not really educated as such, but who are, family and friends. We counter this all the time. And these people who have kind of gone off the deep end over the past few years.
I don't really know, because it's a full-time job if you decide to take it up sometimes. But I typically what I do is I pick my battles. If there are groups in which there are other young cousins, etc., then I fight back. I laugh. I make jokes. If it's a group of people who I know, anyway, privileged brats who are not going to change, it doesn't make sense wasting my time on them. I just leave. I mean, I'm sorry for the language that I'm using, but this is exactly what I do. I just leave it. But so you pick your battles, but engaging with some of this, especially when there are people who at least are willing to listen, is the only way in which you do it. But otherwise, I think I would always think that the political mobilization and the audience for political mobilization is not these people who sit and send WhatsApp forwards and without thinking. I think that is a very different political space that we need to occupy. We shouldn't lose sight of that while trying to fend off 1 or 2 uncles here. I think that's something that we should remember.
Right. But the thing is, this WhatsApp forwards have a wide reach, and people get swayed, and people who normally, who I think wouldn't, they start to have doubts and have these questions, and so that's what I worry about.
Yeah.
And the amount of the extent to how much you can engage And this can be a full-time job, actually.
Right, that's what. That's exactly why I said, you have to pick your battles, decide what to do. Some of the things that, all of these people who have done, this fake news busting sites, etc., have done some decent work over the last few years of trying to at least, give you ready-made material to be able to counter some of these things. But there is such a barrage of this coming from the IT cell. I mean, there is only so much you can do to counter it. That's why I said that it's probably we have to think of other political spaces to occupy to be able to mobilize against this. Because I'm not sure whether individually we can respond to this kind of or how effectively we can respond beyond a point.
Thank you.
Any more questions? We're well over time. So Tejal, thank you so much for the fascinating talk, and you were edited as always, absolutely fantastic. And thank you for engaging with us for so long as well.
A lot of fun.
Nana, would you like to wrap this up?
No, I think you've done it. So thank you, I guess, to everyone else for coming and staying and listening to what was an excellent talk.
Next week, 6:30 p.m. Monday, same Zoom link. We'll have